Welcome to Everyday Economics, a weekly podcast about the economics in daily life. I'm your host, Pooja Mehra. In 1990, it was quite clear to economists working in government that a crisis was imminent. They briefed Prime Minister VP Singh about it. In June 1990, VP Singh asked his advisor Montek Singh Ahluwalia for a note. Dr. Ahluwalia prepared a 34-page paper titled Restructuring India's Industrial, Trade and Fiscal Policies, which was an intellectual framework for a 5-year agenda for reforms. This note was leaked to the press. Journalists could guess who may have authored it, but no confirmations were forthcoming. Economist and columnist Dr. Ashok Desai christened it the M document. The VP Singh government did absolutely nothing on this medium-term strategy. Singh, Dr. Ahluwalia writes in his book Backstage, was too focused on short-term political objectives. Industry Secretary A.N. Verma and Industry Minister Jeet Singh were strongly supportive, but Finance Minister Madhu Dandavate and Finance Ministry officials were obstructive. It was clear that by the second half of 1990, a balance of payment crisis was near certain. The government tightened import controls, but the situation was so grave that it did not help much. The widening current account deficit was financed by increased resort to external borrowings combined with a decline in reserves. The Reserve Bank of India was coming to the view that a loan from the IMF would have to be negotiated. But it was equally clear that the well-known positions of George Fernandes and Madhu Dandavate would make it nearly impossible for the National Front government to reach an agreement with the IMF. VP Singh asked Dr. Ahluwalia if a loan from the IMF will have to be negotiated. Dr. Ahluwalia told the Prime Minister that reserves were running very low. I told him frankly that the IMF was the only possible source of getting the necessary funding to keep going a little longer while taking corrective steps. If IMF funding was ruled out for political reasons, we needed to act immediately and more or less in the same direction as the IMF would want. My advice was that there was merit in approaching the IMF, but he would have to defend the policy package as in the country's interest. On 2nd August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. This became the immediate trigger that precipitated India's balance of payment crisis. Crude prices doubled, the current account deficit was hit by the fall in remittances from the Gulf, Moody's downgraded India a notch, foreign banks ceased to extend loans, the Government of India drew down on India's reserve tranche at the IMF. Soon, political troubles flared up. VP Singh resigned in November 1990 after losing the vote of confidence in Lok Sabha. He had inherited the balance of payment problem but made no attempt to introduce corrective steps despite ample advance warning. He came to the government when forex reserves were 3.6 billion. By the time he resigned, forex reserves had dwindled to 1.9 billion, enough to finance just about 3 weeks of imports. India now stared at defaults, something that had never happened before with India's external obligations. Next, Chandrasekhar became the Prime Minister. This government was even more vulnerable than VP Singh's. It had all of 64 MPs. Chandrasekhar ordered a bureaucratic reshuffle. Dr. Ahluwalia was moved from the Prime Minister's office to Commerce at his own request, since Finance, his first choice, was going to IS officer S.P. Shukla. Finance Secretary Bimal Jalan was appointed Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Dr. Manmohan Singh was appointed Economic Advisor to Prime Minister Chandrasekhar. This government faced an impossible situation. It had run out of forex reserves. Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha tried to seek bilateral assistance from Japan but to no avail. In January 1991, Government of India borrowed from the IMF for 3 months. This tranche had minimum conditionality. Another tranche was borrowed from another low conditionality channel of the IMF. But the reserves kept declining. The situation was getting out of hand. A large loan was needed. Before it could be obtained, the Chandrasekhar government fell and elections were announced. North Block and Reserve Bank of India continued to stave off default in face of erosion of the reserves, which were now at all-time low, enough for barely 2 weeks of imports. In May 1991, Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha authorized the State Bank of India to sell 20 tons of gold from the Government of India stock to the Union Bank of Switzerland. He also authorized negotiations for pledging 47 tons of gold from the gold reserves as collateral for a loan of $600 million from the Bank of England and Bank of Japan. By the time this transaction was completed, a new government was in office. It was headed by P.V. Narasimha Rao after Rajiv Gandhi, under whom the Congress had fought the election, was assassinated. The new government was sworn in on 21st June 1991. Before the swearing-in ceremony, a meeting was called by the Prime Minister-designate in the Prime Minister's office to finalize his first broadcast to the nation scheduled for the next day. Invitees included Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Cabinet Secretary Naresh Chandra, Finance Secretary S.P. Shukla, and Chief Economic Advisor Deepak Nair. The Cabinet Secretary told the Prime Minister that India was in serious economic crisis and assistance from the IMF will be needed. Also, that he will have to think about the reforms that the World Bank and the IMF will no doubt insist on to make the assistance available. In other words, conditions will have to be satisfied if the assistance was to be obtained. This would need him to take difficult decisions. Before the meeting ended, P.V. Narasimha Rao told Dr. Manmohan Singh, "Manmohan, you know what needs to be done. Why don't you work on this in your office in North Block and send me a draft text later in the day about what I should say on TV?" That's when it became clear that Dr. Manmohan Singh was going to be the finance minister. Today, even 30 years after 1991, few Indians realize how the crisis built up, how it was resolved, and who should get credit for pulling India back from the brink of bankruptcy. Even fewer realize what difference the 1991 reforms made to our daily lives. My guest on Everyday Economics today is not an economist, but someone who has written an authoritative account of the reforms of 1991. Of the many books on this theme, this book stands out because of its annexures that support every claim made in the book with documentary evidence. This book is called To the Brink and Back, and its author, Jairam Ramesh, was a key aide in Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao's office during the period the main decisions pertaining to the reforms were taken. Later, when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, Mr. Ramesh held important cabinet portfolios. In today's conversation, Mr. Ramesh is exceptionally candid and forthcoming, and he goes beyond anything published till date on the theme of the 1991 reforms. I would rate this as the most insightful interview any journalist on the persisting questions and puzzles from those historic weeks has published so far. But I apologize for the poor quality of the audio, which was recorded over a weak internet connection.
Hi, Mr. Ramesh. Welcome to Everyday Economics.
Hi, Pooja.
So it's nearly 30 years since the 1991 reforms were started. And what that means is there are a lot of people, young people today, who don't really know what significance those reforms have in their everyday life. And your book, To the Brink and Back, is an account from the 20th of June 1991, which is the date on which P.V. Narasimha Rao was elected the leader of the Congress Parliamentary Party, to 31st August 1991. After which he moved you from the Prime Minister's office to the Planning Commission. So your book is an account of these 72 days, and you say in your book that you were the Sherpa for the reforms process in the PMO. And therefore, you're ideally placed to help listeners, especially young listeners, understand the importance of the reforms in their lives, understand how everyday life changed from how it was before the reforms happened, and also some of the other important things which remain unresolved in public discourse even now. But before I get to those questions about who should get credit, etc., please tell us, how has life changed because of the reforms?
Well, the immediate provocation and trigger for the reforms was the foreign exchange crisis. When Dr. Manmohan Singh became finance minister on the 21st of June, India's foreign exchange reserves were down to less than $900 million, which is about 5 days of imports. Today, our foreign exchange reserves touching $460 billion, so we don't even think about it, but just imagine $900 million and 5 days imports, a threat of bankruptcy looming large, credit ratings going down, and India really being seen internationally as a gone case. Now, this was the immediate trigger, immediate provocation for the reforms. There had been talk of economic liberalization since the mid-80s, but the big bang, the paradigm shift, had not taken place. We were doing things like delicensing, we were doing things like broadbanding, we were doing things like making marginal changes to make exports more attractive and attracting foreign investment. But that big jump, that quantum leap, the paradigm shift, in June 1991, and it took place out of compulsion. It was not, but what was evolving over a period of time suddenly emerged as a big, and basically three things happened. First, on July 24th, 1991, Dr. Manmohan Singh presented his budget, and that budget contained the details of the new industrial policy, which basically made a bonfire out of all industrial controls. removed licensing, removed permits, removed quotas, removed location restrictions, and basically said you are free to produce what you want, where you want, to what capacity you want. So it was a big transformational moment for Indian industry. So that was the first change. A second change that had come about a little earlier was the new trade policy, which was basically which made far more liberal, and it made imports far more liberal in order to make exports. We used to have in the olden days an office called the Chief Controller of Exports and Imports. I can understand controlling imports, but why would we want to control exports? That was the mindset. I mean, it was an export, not just export pessimistic, but export fatalistic, so to speak. New policy was a big paradigm. It eased imports in order to promote exports, and along with it, of course, came a more pragmatic, more liberal, more market-oriented exchange rate policy, which enabled, it was not a one-step devaluation, it was a two-step devaluation. And that moved India forward on the path towards making an exchange rate that was not fixed, but was more in tune with market requirements. The third big change was, of course, in terms of fiscal management. A new fiscal policy. In fact, the word fiscal deficit, many MPs used to ask me, what is this physical deficit? What is this physical deficit? And I had to explain to them, your physical deficit nahi hai, fiscal deficit hai. So, the word we were used, India had been used to the concept of a budget deficit, but from 91 onwards, fiscal deficit became enshrined in our thinking. And basically, the new fiscal policy was that we need to reorient government expenditure. We need to get out of subsidies. We need to get out of wasteful expenditure and focus government expenditure more on productive activities. So these are the three big things: the new industrial policy, the new trade policy, and a completely new fiscal management policy. These were the three big changes that were introduced in those 60 days.
Right.
Of July and August. Then, of course, other changes came. I'm talking only of the foundational moments, and my book is on the foundational moments, because that's where I was a eyewitness, observer. After that, I really moved out to the Planning Commission, looking at more medium-term and long-term issues. However, I think the bulk of what was to come later was set in what happened in the first 60 days, in terms of industrial policy, in terms of trade policy, in terms of exchange rate policy, and in terms of fiscal policy. So this is, I think, broadly speaking, what happened is that, we experienced a huge consumer boom. As our population was becoming younger, consumer instincts were getting stronger, and I think what the liberalization of 90 was make production easy. Okay. So basically what we have seen since 91 is a complete transformational shift, which led to an increased availability of consumption goods, both consumer durables and consumer non-durables. And what was a shortage economy of the 70s and 80s became an economy that was more market determined, based on market requirements, more based on decisions taken not by governments, but by decisions taken by enterprises and companies. If you ask me, I think what happened in 91, we went from being an inward-looking economy to being a more outward-looking economy. We went from being a public sector dominated economy to an economy in which the private sector played an increasing role. And we went from an economy where consumption was not given priority to an economy which was driven by private consumption. These were the paradigm shifts that took place in 1991.
Yes, what I recall, is that as a child, if you wanted to buy a car, for instance, you had just two or three options. You could either buy an Ambassador or a Fiat. And even if you had the money to buy them, you had to wait for long periods of time for the car to
15
be made
years.
available. Yeah, available to you because there were quotas for production. What sense did it make for an economy or for a government to say that you will only produce this many number of whatever it is that you produce and not more? How can it be illegal to produce more than a certain number? What was
Well,
the thinking behind that?
yeah, I mean, we can always have the benefit of hindsight, but we were not a rich country. We were a poor country. We had to use our resources in the maximum, best extent possible, the optimal way. And the thinking was that having more private cars is a drain on the exchequer, and that we need more public investment. We need investment in infrastructure, in railways, in buses, in public transport. So that was private cars were not given a priority in the 50s and 60s. And the capacity licensing, which became part of industrial planning in the 60s, was basically, the thinking was that we must direct private investment to socially desirable areas and not have private industry making all sorts of goods and putting a burden on the country's finances. All countries have gone through this. Japan went through this. Korea went through this. Malaysia went through this, but they got out of it also very quickly. Except that in our system, it took us about, I would say, what happened in 91 should probably have happened in 81. So we came on to it about 10 to 12 years far later. Remember, reforms starts in China. The first wave of reforms starts in China only in 1978. Until 1991, per capita income in India is actually higher than the per capita income in China. The second big wave of reforms in China was when we started our reforms in 91. Of course, the Chinese economy boomed after 91. It was a spectacular growth. I wouldn't call the Indian growth spectacular, but Indian growth was certainly very steady and very much more impressive than what it had been in the past. So it's not as if we were an outlier. This was a dominant consensus at that time, but we got out of that consensus, I think, 10 years too late. But
I,
better late than never.
And what explains this delay? Because, as early as 1971, Dr. Manmohan Singh had written a paper saying, all of these policies needed to change. Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia had written a paper when he worked with VP Singh as Prime Minister, what is now called the M document, detailing
Well, the
all
M
of these
document,
steps. You
no, no,
yourself, when you were in Planning Commission, had written, I think, asked by Dr. Manmohan Singh when he was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission in 1986. I think you wrote about the industrial policy reforms that were needed. So why
timing,
did it take so long?
timing has to be right, the politics has to be right, a sense of crisis has to envelop us. And I think, Dr. Manmohan Singh wrote two notes, one in 1973 and one in 1975, but that didn't get very far. But those were not revolutionary notes, by the way. My note of 86 also proposed a lot of liberalization, but it was not as revolutionary as 91. The M document was a revolutionary document, no doubt about it. But remember, the M document is March of 1990,
Yes.
and the revolution happens in June of 1991. So I wouldn't compare what happened in 91 with Dr. Manmohan Singh's notes of the mid 70s. I wouldn't compare with what happened in mid 91 with even my note of the mid 80s. I would compare it with the M document of March 1990. So, I would say 1 year after the M document, government implemented pretty much what the M document, it went much further than the M document, of course, but nevertheless, the basic framework was the M document, which is a more liberal trade policy, a more liberal exchange rate policy, a completely decontrolled industrial policy, and a fiscal structure which promotes investment rather than government expenditure on subsidies and consumption. So
My
I
my
think
point my point is that this was a crisis. The 1991 BOP balance of payments crisis was a crisis that had been foretold. And the M document actually kind of is evidence of the fact that it was known in policy circles that if those steps were not taken, a crisis would take place. And the first trigger, by way of the Gulf crisis, provided made sure tipped the balance of payments into crisis.
well,
So
the 90s was a politically very volatile period. Remember, 90, the Congress had lost, VP Singh had become prime minister, we had the Mandal Commission riots, then we had the Gulf crisis, then we had massive capital outflow, and then by October, VP Singh had fallen, and an unusual political constellation, a party with 60 MPs became the ruling party, supported by a party from the outside, which had 200 MPs. This can happen only in India, but it happened. 1990, we forget, was a year of great political shock and political uncertainty. And that political instability took its toll on economic policy. One of the reasons why the M document could not be implemented. In fact, the M document was being sabotaged from within the government. Remember, George Fernandez was in the VP Singh government. He was not particularly keen on the M document. Ajit Singh, who was the industry minister, was blowing hot, blowing cold. He was not sure. So the M document never put.
Finance Minister Madhu Dandavate was also
And
not.
Finance Minister Madhu Dandavate completely opposed to the M document. You had the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Mr. Ramakrishna Hegde, again deeply suspicious of what the M document was recommending. So the politics of 1990 was such that they could not implement it. Now, what happened in 91 was that you had a crisis. And then nothing concentrates the mind more than the crisis. Now, Mr. Narasimha Rao was the biggest anti-reformer of the 80s. I mean, he was no reformer. He didn't come to reforms out of conviction. In fact, on issues like the public sector and so on, in 87, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi had promised a white paper on the public sector. That white paper on the public sector never came out because the chairman of the group of ministers was Mr. Narasimha Rao. And, they stonewalled, they filibustered. They were simply not interested in reforming the public sector. So,
and in your book, you note that Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, in fact, was severely critical of the Vajpayee government's plans for privatization, especially Air India, for instance. He was opposed to reforms.
Yeah, but that was after. That was in 2000, 2001. Yes. Yes. I'm talking of pre-91. In pre-91, Mr. Narasimha Rao was not a great reformer. And I can tell you from my own practical experience that for example, on issues of the public sector, he kept saying, how can we abandon the public sector? He was opposed to disinvestment. How can we have disinvestment? How can we, public sector is meant for social objectives. We must not look at the public sector only through the lens of profitability. I mean, these are all the themes that he was propagating. But when he became prime minister, he realized that here was a crisis and it required a major shift in economic thinking. And I think Mr. Narasimha Rao saw it this as an opportunity for getting into the history books himself. He knew he was taking a big risk, but I think his biggest masterstroke, his finest masterstroke, was to bring Dr. Manmohan Singh as finance minister, because what that did was that it immediately gave international respectability to economic policy in India, and more importantly, it gave domestic acceptability. Remember, Dr. Manmohan Singh was a moderate left of center. All the great leftists of India of that time, starting with Jyoti Basu, Ashim Das Gupta, Ashok Mitra, K.N. Raj. These were all people who held Dr. Manmohan Singh in the highest of esteem. And I have actually explained in my book how Mr. Narasimha Rao was deeply doubtful of Dr. Manmohan Singh's budget of July 24th. And he was always asking whether we had done the right thing on reforms. And I showed him an interview that had appeared in Frontline, in which K.N. Raj had given a long interview. And K.N. Raj said, if my friend Manmohan has said we must do these economic reforms, then I believe him, because he's a man of unimpeachable integrity and dignity. And Mr. Narasimha Rao was very happy. He asked me to make photocopies of that article and circulate it, to some members of the Congress party and others. So I think Dr. Manmohan Singh's appointment was key, because the international community had got a vote of confidence, and more importantly, domestically, remember Mr. Vajpayee, Mr. Advani, Mr. VP Singh, Mr. Chandrasekhar. Dr. Manmohan Singh had been Mr. Chandrasekhar's economic advisor. He was very well known in the Congress party. He was Mrs. Indira Gandhi's blue-eyed boy, chief economic advisor, governor of the Reserve Bank, deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, you name it, and that position had been occupied by him. So Dr. Manmohan Singh occupied a unique position. He's the first and last man to have occupied that position in Indian economic policy. And when he became finance minister, and you see, it's in reforms, Pooja, it's not just important what is said, but it's also important who is saying it. Yes. And with Manmohan Singh saying it, see the same impact if I.G. Patel had become finance minister. And I.G. Patel was Narasimha Rao's first choice. I don't think it would have had the same impact, because I.G. Patel was known to be, slightly market-oriented, slightly right of center, Morarji Desai's blue-eyed boy, and so on. But Manmohan Singh had solid left credentials. He was a planner. He had been in the Reserve Bank. He had been deputy chairman and member secretary of the Planning Commission. And he had been Indira Gandhi's economic advisor for 5 years. So, who says it is equally important. So there are three things: what is said, when it is said, and who says it. And I think in June 91, all the three W's, the two W's and one H, what, who, and what, who, and when. Sorry, all three W's, I should say. All three of them came together very well.
And do you think that Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao's choice of finance minister candidates was also influenced by the fact that Mr. Rajiv Gandhi had cleared 3 names for finance minister, according to your book, and Dr. Manmohan Singh was one of the names on that list. The other one was I.G. Patel.
Well, I think ultimately Dr. P.C. Alexander prevailed. I think the weight of evidence shows that it was Dr. Alexander who advised Narasimha Rao wanted I.G. Patel. I.G. Patel was approached. I.G. Patel declined. And I think P.C. Alexander, who had a hand in making Dr. Manmohan Singh deputy chairman of the Planning Commission when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi had become prime minister in early of 1985, suggested Dr. Manmohan Singh's name. And Manmohan Singh was known to Narasimha Rao. And Narasimha Rao felt comfortable with Manmohan Singh because broadly, ideologically, both of them, they came from that broad school.
Right. And as you also note in your book, that in 1974, Dr. Manmohan Singh was in fact the principal author of the package through which Mrs. Indira Gandhi had reduced inflation triggered by the first global oil shock and the drought, when inflation...
Manmohan Singh really he made his reputation. Remember, we had 20% plus inflation in 74, 75, 75, 76. And that the dragon of inflation was, if at all it has been slayed, it was slayed in those 3 years. And that was a ruthless, savage anti-inflationary measure.
It wages came down to 0% in 1978-79.
Wages were impounded, DA was impounded. You look at it, and that is where Dr. Manmohan Singh really made his reputation. And that's where Indira Gandhi recognized the value of Dr. Singh as an economic administrator. So, coming back to Mr. Narasimha Rao, I think that was an inspired choice. That was a masterstroke. Dr. Manmohan Singh, he knew what had to be done. And for the first time, he was not just an advisor, he was an executor. He was finance minister. And I think Mr. Narasimha Rao also recognized, but Mr. Narasimha Rao was far more reluctant. Mr. Narasimha Rao was very reluctant on devaluation, very reluctant. It was only Dr. Manmohan Singh and Dr. Rangarajan who finally convinced him. He was very reluctant to go to the IMF. In fact, till the last, he kept asking me to have, explore back channels with Dr. Arjun Sengupta, who was then with the IMF, who had somehow suggested to Mr. Narasimha Rao that you don't require to go to the IMF. So, but Mr. Narasimha Rao was a very, very reluctant reformer in the first 3-4 months. But once, his reforms started showing results, first moderately and then subsequently in substantial measure, he became far more confident, and by mid-1993, I would say he became the strongest votary of his own reforms.
And what was the role of the IMF's conditionality in precipitating the reform process? Of course, there was this general knowledge in the policy circles in India that this is what that was required to be done, but the political, the politics was not allowing it to take place. Did the fact that India had literally no option but to, accept a bailout from the IMF, and which came along with certain conditions, was that the final?
Pooja, we had 4 options before us on the 20th of June or the 21st of June, 1991. Let me quickly take you through the 4 options. And in fact, this was discussed. First option was to declare a default. The declaration of a default is based on a very well-known principle of finance, that if you owe somebody $500, you should be worried. If you owe somebody $5 million, he should be worried, right? So, we owe the world millions of dollars. So what? We default. Latin American countries have defaulted. Now, this default option, in fact, Ajit Patel subsequently talked about this default option and very cautiously saying that we should have defaulted. But the default option, Dr. Manmohan Singh ruled out. And it didn't look good because India had always, it never defaulted. It had been very prudent in its borrowing. And so the default option, certainly, the left parties were asking for a default option. But I think Dr. Manmohan Singh instinctively recoiled against the default option and said that the default option would be a declaration that India is completely bankrupt and it would be counterproductive. So that option was ruled out. The second option, which Narasimha Rao was very keen on, was the NRI option. In fact, he asked me to speak to Abid Hussain, who was then our ambassador in Washington, for him to contact some NRIs. The Sultan of Brunei had offered Narasimha Rao $5 billion through Chandraswamy. And in fact, a jet had been organized to take Chandraswamy to Brunei, to the Sultan of Brunei, till Dr. Manmohan Singh had to put his foot down. So the NRI option. But the NRI option, I had to explain to Mr. Narasimha Rao at one stage that, there was capital flight taking place. Starting from October of 1990, NRIs were actually withdrawing money from India. Something like $200 million a month was going out of India from the NRI deposits, FCNR deposits. And at a point of time when the confidence was low, and we were a minority government. We didn't even have a majority. Remember, the Congress party had only about 220 odd MPs in 1991. For us to say that we are going to depend only on NRIs when NRIs are taking out the money was clearly very unrealistic. So the NRI option was ruled out. The third option was what Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, would say in Parliament. हमारे देश में बहुत सोना है. इस सोने का इस्तेमाल होना चाहिए. That what we should do is we should use something like the gold bonds of Morarji in the 1960s, and we should use our gold reserves. Now the point with the gold reserves was, if you remember, Pooja, Yashwant Sinha, had to mortgage 40 tons of gold, and he's never been able to live down that period. Of mortgaging gold and borrowing against the gold. And in any case, how much of gold are you going to mortgage? Because our requirements were not, a few hundred million. Our requirements were a few $billion. So the gold option was ruled out. The NRI option was ruled out. The default option was ruled out. So the only option was the IMF option. The IMF and the World Bank were offering you a safety net of a few $1 billion, $3 to $4 billion, and they were telling us, okay, we'll give you the money provided you do all the sensible things that you yourselves have been wanting to do since the mid 80s. So if you ask me, without the IMF, would 91 reforms have taken place? The answer is no. They were absolutely essential. Did the IMF dictate the reforms? The answer because the reforms were well known. Rakesh Mohan was there, Monte Ahluwalia was there, Mr. Amarnath Verma was there. I had a small role to play, and most of all, Dr. Manmohan Singh himself was there. So I don't think we needed anybody to tell us what needs to be done. But the fact of getting it done was directly linked to the IMF. So if the IMF was not there, these reforms would not have taken place in mid of 1991.
Yes, the knowledge and what had to be done was there. It was in fact documented in writing, and it was the push from the IMF, the conditionality from the IMF that kind of created the conducive conditions for it.
They were leaning, I would call it, they were leaning on an open door,
Yeah.
We knew what is to be done. Many, in fact, the IMF, the letter that we sent to the IMF, normally in other countries, the IMF drafts it. But in our case, we drafted very large sections of the conditionality letter. So, the word conditionality in the Indian context, I would, it's not the same as say, it's not like Brazil or Indonesia,
I mean, it's misunderstood.
We were waiting for our arms to be twisted, and I think the IMF triggered that arm twisting.
We offered our arms to be twisted. But another confusion in the public discourse, and I find amongst very senior political journalists, is that the architect of the reforms was Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, and that seems very far removed from the reality from what you've already said.
He's not the architect. He's certainly not the architect. Anybody who says that he's an architect just does not know the facts. He provided the political support, he provided the political umbrella, he provided the political backing, he provided the political cover for Dr. Manmohan Singh. The architect was clearly Dr. Manmohan Singh. But could Narasimha Rao have done these reforms without Manmohan Singh? No. Could Manmohan Singh have done these reforms without Narasimha Rao? No. I think this was a jugalbandi.
But I want to press you more on this, because you have in your book said that, in the Congress parliamentary party meetings, the finance minister got a lonely figure and the prime minister did nothing to alleviate his distress. In another place, you say that when Mr. Narasimha Rao organized a meeting with opposition leaders such as L.K. Advani, etc., and called his finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, to explain the reforms, Dr. Manmohan Singh was completely on his own. He received no support from the prime minister. There's another example of the urea prices, which triggered a mini revolt in the Congress party. Again, Dr. Manmohan Singh was on his own. When it came to the industrial policy, getting Congress party support for it, it was left for you to attach a preamble to it. And I think on June 25th, within 4 days of becoming finance minister, it was said that the government started with a self-goal because the finance minister announced something on pricing and the prime minister did not support him. Did P.V. Narasimha Rao really support Manmohan Singh, or was he really there on his own, building public opinion, speaking in parliament, giving interviews to the press, and generally telling Indian people what he was doing with his reforms?
He was using Dr. Manmohan Singh as a punching bag. He did not want to be in the front. He told Dr. Manmohan Singh after a working committee meeting, if things go right, I take the credit. If things go wrong, you will take the blame. He told this to Dr. Manmohan Singh. I've quoted this in the book. I think this was on the 22nd of June. He told this. And Arjun Singh, all these great leaders of the Congress party were present. So Dr. Manmohan Singh never supported. I mean, when, there were about 340 MPs who were attacking Dr. Manmohan Singh on his July 24th budget. There were only two MPs who supported Dr. Manmohan Singh. Only two MPs. One was Nathuram Mirza, from Rajasthan, and the other, you will be shocked when I tell you, is Manishankar Iyer. These were the only two people who supported Dr. Manmohan Singh, and Mr. Narasimha Rao kept quiet. He allowed Dr. Manmohan Singh to take all the flak. Mr. Vajpayee, would attack all the time. Narasimha Rao would say nothing. Chandrasekhar would attack. Narasimha Rao would say nothing. But remember, he quietly backed whatever Manmohan Singh wanted. Two-step devaluation, reluctant backer. Delicensing, reluctant backer. Complete overhaul of import-export regime. Chidambaram started it, reluctant backer. But he never backtracked. The only time that Narasimha Rao got cold feet, the only day he got cold feet was, I think, on the 18th of August, when there was a coup against Gorbachev. And, he gave a public speech while addressing the Youth Congress, saying that this is what happens to reformers. We should not go very fast on reforms. And I remember Dr. Manmohan Singh calling me and saying, what does the statement mean? Is the Prime Minister backtracking on reforms? But no, this was, this was Mr. Narasimha Rao indulging in loud thinking. Remember, Mr. Narasimha Rao was a man who played chess with himself. He was constantly moving pawns here and there, looking two steps ahead. He never wavered in his support for Dr. Manmohan Singh. A lot of people would go and complain to him, give him notes. Many of those notes would come to me. But he never said, he never wrote anything on it. He just said, have a look at it, and do whatever you want. So in my view, he backed Dr. Manmohan Singh to the hilt. And when Manmohan Singh was under attack, from people like Arjun Singh, Fatedar, Balram Jhakar, Rajesh Pilot, he backed him completely, backed him to the hilt. But not in public. In public, he allowed Dr. Manmohan Singh to take the flak. But internally, he protected.
Right. But what that did is that, it failed to create a public sentiment for reforms, and therefore till today we see Prime Minister.
That started in 93, Pooja. That started in 93 because nobody was sure how these reforms would work out. Remember, if you look at the data for 91, 92, the uptick in growth rate starts in 92, 93 in a very small way, and it's only after 93, 94 that confidence begins to return, that the Indian economy is now on a growing path. Now, once the Indian economy starts growing, by mid 1993, in fact, in 1992, Mr. Narasimha Rao in Davos is very circumspect. It is not a very aggressive speech that he makes in Davos. He talks about the middle path. But by the middle of 1993, when growth begins to show an upward climb, when Indian businessmen begin to speak, that time, remember, Indian business also was very unhappy. The Bombay Club, Rahul Bajaj, Harishankar Singhania, S.K. Birla, the whole FICCI
Anand
crowd.
Mahindra, who you told was speaking, a young Anand Mahindra, who you told was speaking like a JNU student, you say in your book.
I remember Anand Mahindra talking in FICCI and saying India requires internal liberalization first and external liberalization later. And I told Anand, this is like a PhD student from JNU talking. What is it? Internal liberalization, external liberalization. How do you make this distinction? And the fact is that you need imports to export. I mean, don't you see that? Anand will not talk like that now, but this was the talk in 91. You see, Indian industry saw foreign investment as a threat. Indian industry saw international trade, liberal international trade as a threat. So it's not just politicians and bureaucrats. that Dr. Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao were fighting, they were also fighting the Bombay Club. They were fighting these iconic figures of Indian industry who had been used to a protectionist market.
Yes, and to talk of the budget of 1991, what do you think makes it stand out so much, apart from, of course, the policy decisions that were taken, but wasn't the masterstroke that Dr. Singh was able to explain what he was doing and why he was doing it and why it was necessary to do it, which very few finance ministers are able to do when they're when they're introducing big policy changes that people sometimes are scared of?
Well, I think there are many things of the 1991 budget, Pooja, that have become history. First, it revealed a very unknown side of Dr. Manmohan Singh, which is his fondness for Muhammad Iqbal. Nobody could associate this dark, serious man who never laughs, never cracks a joke, was actually a great student and a great admirer of Iqbal and of Urdu poetry. In fact, Dr. Manmohan Singh can't read Hindi. He reads Hindi in Urdu script. That's because of his childhood and his upbringing. So that one, the great fondness for Iqbal really came out in the budget speech. The substance of the budget speech was, of course, the industrial policy that was contained in the budget. The details were announced separately, but the fact that India was going to have a completely new industrial policy was announced in a budget. That was the second highlight. The third highlight was he explained, why we need to have a completely different approach to managing government finances. He was not very successful in taking that forward. He was partially successful, but he managed to explain it in very simple language. And I think it was an emotional speech. It was written by Dr. Manmohan Singh. Finance ministers never write their own budgets. But Dr. Manmohan Singh wrote the 91 budget from the first word till the last word. It was him speaking. It was very personal, very moving. He made it, appear as if he was speaking from the heart and not just from the head. I think that's what sets the 91 budget speech apart from all other budget speeches.
I think, yeah, he probably was speaking from the heart. And often, the credit for the industrial policy statement is given to the Prime Minister, Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. But you've written in your book that it was back in 1986 that it was Dr. Manmohan Singh who had asked you and Abid Hussain to prepare an agenda for industrial policy reforms. And it completely came out of, his intellectual position.
Yeah. I absolutely. In fact, the note that I've reproduced in the book, it's September of 1980. If I remember, September of 1986.
Yes.
That was a note on industrial policy that Dr. Manmohan Singh wanted, and in fact, we made it. It was prepared by a large number of people. Rakesh Mohan was involved. Nitin Desai was involved. Vijay Kelkar was involved. Bimal Jalan was involved. Montek Ahluwalia was involved. I was, of course, since I'd been asked to put it together, I put it together. But it was a combination of ideas that have come, and Dr. Manmohan Singh also contributed quite a lot to the preparation of that paper. So yeah,
and how did you send it to the Congress Party?
And after 86, of course, Rakesh worked in the industry ministry, and he came up with an update of that 1986, which took that 1986 note much forward, much ahead. And many of the ideas of the M document really came out of what Rakesh had been advocating as economic advisor in the Congress, in the Ministry of Industry. How was it sold in the Congress Party? I've explained this. Mr. Narasimha Rao did not want to, he panicked the first time the industrial policy went to the cabinet. It was rejected. Arjun Singh rejected it. Jhakar rejected it. Madhav Singh Solanki rejected it. Mr. Fotedar rejected it. Mr. Rajesh Pilot rejected it. Everybody rejected it. And finally, Mr. Narasimha Rao called me and said, look, this has got nowhere because this policy is seen to be completely dismantling the structure of whatever we've been doing for the last 50 years. So we have to somehow revive, we have to keep this cabinet note alive. So I remember asking him, I said, sir, I mean, are you sold on the substance of what we are doing? So he said, yes, absolutely. I don't want to dilute anything. Then I said, okay, you leave it to me, give me 24 hours, let me think about a way of, what can be done. So I went back, did some homework, did some thinking, and wrote out that famous preamble, 8-9 page preamble. And the last line of the preamble was, our policy has always been change with continuity, you know. So and that same industrial policy, which had been rejected by the cabinet, went back to the cabinet. And Mr. Podedar looked at this and said, ये तो बढ़िया है, ये तो बढ़िया है, ये approve करना चाहिए. And moment Podedar said this, Arjun Singh fell in line and everybody else fell in line, So that was the small sort of, side cameo role I played on the industrial policy.
But I find to now move away a little from 1991 and come to the UPA government's experience, I find that this internal conflict of the Congress party played out also in the UPA government's cabinet, where a lot of things that Dr. Manmohan Singh, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Finance Minister P. Chidambaram, a lot of things that they wanted to do, they were not succeeding because they were facing tremendous opposition from cabinet colleagues.
But that's not true. Yeah, Pooja, that's not true. Well, Dr. Manmohan Singh wanted the. Let me just finish 1 second, and then we can continue this. Dr. Manmohan Singh wanted the Indo-US nuclear agreement. He got the Indo-US nuclear agreement. The Congress party had serious reservations, but ultimately it fell in line. Multi-brand retail. Congress party had reservations, but ultimately government got what it wanted. On extensive disinvestment, the Congress party had reservations, but ultimately Dr. Manmohan Singh got what he wanted. So this is a myth to say that Dr. Manmohan Singh and Mr. Ahluwalia and Mr. Chidambaram were not able to do things that they wanted. I mean, name me two things that they wanted to do which they were unable to do because of the Congress party. I can't think.
I will give you an example from your ministry, which is the Land Acquisition Amendment Bill. And let me quote P. Chidambaram when he spoke to me for my book, in fact, and he said that I think it was the right decision to get rid of the old Land Acquisition Act because the old Land Acquisition Act was a colonial anti-farmer law that gave a pittance to the farmer while conferring a bounty on the industrialist for whom the land was acquired. The procedure was totally undemocratic. What made the act appear to be an obstruction to industrial development was not the compensation part, but the procedural part, which became too difficult for any district collector or any land acquisition officer to negotiate. How do you get the consent of 75% or 80% of landowners? No district collector, no land acquisition officer had the capacity or the wherewithal to negotiate those provisions which were written into the law, although on paper they appeared very democratic and very liberal. I asked him, if he agreed with this amendment, and he said, no, I had expressed my reservations. I said nobody can acquire land through this mechanism. So I asked him, if there were reservations, how is it that the legislation went through? And he said, but I do not have a dissenting vote. It was consensus finally. A lot of ministers went with this particular amendment. The National Advisory Council was behind it. The intent of the act was good, but the provisions were such that no one would have been able to negotiate, to acquire land for industrialization. And he goes on to say that he, Dr. Ahluwalia and Dr. Singh held, they were sort of on one side of this argument and the rest of the cabinet was on the other side.
He's right. I mean, there were issues on which, there were differences of opinion. Finally, a group of ministers was constituted. Finally, Mr. Chidambaram forgets that there was a group of ministers under Mr. Sharad Pawar that finally gave its nod to this land acquisition bill. Mr. Sharad Pawar was the chairman of the group of ministers.
Yes, so what I'm saying is that...
it's not true to say that, there was a discussion for almost over 12 months, on the Land Acquisition Act. And I still have deep disagreements with what Chidambaram has said. and with what Monte Ahluwalia has said in his book on land acquisition, I think they're completely wrong. Absolutely wrong.
But what I'm saying is that, Dr. Singh agrees more with them.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Dr. Singh, yeah, maybe he would have maybe he would have preferred, if you ask me, would he have preferred a lighter law than what was passed? Yeah, probably yes. I mean, I think so. But the fact that the new land acquisition law was needed and that higher compensation needed to be paid, I don't think that was under dispute.
But the point is that that Land Acquisition Act has ensured that not much land has got acquired.
Please remember that the
It has
Land
not been a
Acquisition Act
success.
went through a standing committee, and it was passed unanimously in Parliament by all political parties after
Yes.
2 all-party meetings.
Yes, I remember Miss Sushma Swaraj speaking in favor of it.
And people representing the BJP were no less than Mr. Arun Jaitley and Mrs. Sushma Swaraj.
Yes.
And Mr. Rajnath Singh calling me every other day, asking me what the hell is happening to the Land Acquisition Act. So, these are all facts. These are all realities, which we can't run away from.
But what I'm saying is that the red flags that were raised by Mr. Chidambaram, and we assume that, he had the support of Dr. Singh, they've,
I wouldn't say red flag. I think it was a different point of view. I respect his point of view. I disagree with that point of view. I did not agree with his point of view. I had disagreements with him on environmental issues as well.
Right.
So yeah, sure, I had my views, but I think see, obviously, we arrive at a consensus finally. We have a discussion, we arrive at a consensus.
So that's what I'm saying, that this is an example of the sort of the.
I've given you examples of the nuclear agreement and retail, where or the free trade agreements for that matter. The Congress party was not, greatly hot on some of these free trade agreements, but the Prime Minister had his way. I think that's how it is. The party expresses its view. Sometimes the party's view prevail. Sometimes the party's view does not prevail. You take the RCEP, for example. Had the RSS not put its foot down, Mr. Modi would have gone and signed the RCEP agreement on the 4th of November last year in Bangkok.
Right.
So, the party wins. The party, sometimes we're in a democratic setup here. Party, sometimes the party's view prevail, sometimes the executive's views prevail.
Do you now have second thoughts on the land acquisition amendment?
Me? Absolutely not. I have absolutely no thought.
Not much land has got acquired under it.
Land does not need to be acquired. The whole idea of the Land Acquisition Act is to stop the land acquisition. Why should land be acquired? Land should be purchased if you want to buy land. And what about the thousands and thousands of hectares of land that every government is sitting on? Rajasthan government is sitting on something like 30 to 40,000 hectares of land on so-called industrial estate land that has been acquired at cheap rates. So I don't subscribe to this view at all that it is this Land Acquisition Act that has come in the way of economic growth. Certainly.
Okay, so 2 final questions. What is the economic ideology of the Congress party today? How has it changed since independence? And from what you're saying, it's quite clear that there's probably no one economic ideology of the Congress. There are many, different individuals in the Congress party that have different views. So, what is the party's position on economic ideology and how it has evolved? And the second question is that, what do you think is the sitting government, that is the Modi government's economic ideology?
Well, I think the Congress is a center-left party. Okay, it's not a left of center party. It's a center-left party, and therefore, I think it has remained a center-left party. Now, sometimes the center has become, the centrist position has been strong. Sometimes the left position has been strong, but is actually a centrist party. And it has, I would say even the 91 reforms, people see it as market-oriented reforms. Yeah, of course it is market-oriented reforms, but they were social democratic in nature as well. For example, we did not embark on wholesale financial liberalization. Even Dr. Manmohan Singh was not a great votary of financial liberalization, and he still isn't. We have not embarked on aggressive privatization, for example. We have done disinvestment, but certainly not privatization. So, I think the Congress Party's economic ideology has changed over the years necessarily, because what was relevant in the 50s need not be relevant again in the 21st century. There are, the needs of the economy are different. The private sector has grown. The public sector needs to be a little more selective, a little more focused. But I think the broad elements of that economic policy, that there must be a role for the state, and that the role of the state must be to build physical and social infrastructure and to improve the bargaining power of economic agents, like landowners, for example, that remains undiluted. I don't see that change. Now, what distinguishes the Congress from the BJP? I think I don't think the Congress Party would have embarked on a policy of ruthless privatization like this government has embarked. I think that is certainly one area in which this government is completely, the Congress government would be completely different than the present government. No doubt about it.
By privatization, what do you mean? Air India?
No, not just Air India. Yeah, it's just, look at what's happened in the coal sector. Look at the announcements that have been made in the oil sector. Look at the announcements that have been made in the steel sector. And who knows what is in store for us in the banking sector. So, on privatization, I think the Congress Party's stand is markedly different than the stand that the present government has taken so far, and will probably take in the future as well.
But are you not convinced that having public sector banks is sort of a recipe for again and again having an NPA blow up? Use of public sector banks to bail out select private players.
You mean Yes Bank had no NPAs? You mean
but
ICICI Bank?
No, but Yes Bank was bailed out by State Bank of India. That's an example that I am giving.
I'm asking you about the private banks. You mean the private banks didn't have NPAs?
I'm not saying that the private banks didn't have NPAs. I'm saying once the private banks have NPAs because of mismanagement, who pays for it? It is State Bank of India that is pushed into paying for it.
Public sector bails them out. Absolutely.
Exactly.
What happened to the textile industry? All the Sikh textile mills were bled white by their owners. The jute mills were bled white, and they were ultimately taken over by the public sector. So,
and what happened? What happened after that? So much tax money was poured into them, and nothing came out of it.
Some of them got revived. In the case of the textile, at least, hopefully, some of the resources generated from land sales have gone into huge VRS that was given for the textile industry.
You can't possibly defend.
Sorry?
I'm saying you can't possibly defend, such nationalization.
Well, it was nationalization of last resort, yeah. Look at it. At one point of time, almost 25 to 30%. In the mid 80s, I remember when I first did this exercise, almost 25 to 30% of all the losses of public sector, when people were saying public sector is loss making, about a quarter or so, or between a quarter and a third of those losses were because of the taken over units.
They should have, if they were insolvent, they should have been allowed to,
It was difficult. It's difficult, the insolvency and bankruptcy code, the timing for the IBC to come. After all, we have come to the IBC through a process of evolution. We had SICA, we had BIFR, then we had SARFEC, then we had Debt Recovery Tribunal, and then we had the IBC. So, we came to it after after a long evolutionary process. It's not that we came to the IBC all of a sudden. We had about 25 years of experience of what works and what doesn't work. Anyway, the basic point that you raise, I think certainly in one area, in the area of privatization, there would be a very marked difference between what a Congress regime would do and what this government has certainly been shown to be doing.
Right. And just a follow-up question, and this is my last question. What is your party's idea of a growth model? Where would growth come from? Mr. Modi's government's idea so far, what I've seen is this whole welfare model where the public sector provides cheap loans by name of Mudra, or public sector provides cooking gas connections subsidized through direct benefit transfers. But the state providing all these things is not a substitute for the economy generating sustainable livelihoods. Same holds, by the way, for NREGA. It is a social safety net, but it is not a source of sustainable livelihood, without which people cannot really truly exit poverty. So what is the economic growth model that the Congress party thinks is appropriate for Indian economy?
Well, the growth model is the model that delivered 8% growth over a decade. I mean, actions speak louder than...
That was global boom.
Sorry?
That was availability of cheap global funding, investments.
We can argue why. The bottom line is that the Congress government, or UPA government, of which the Congress was the leader, delivered 8% growth over a decade. The actions speak louder than words. No, you can say whatever.
There was no model. The whole global economy was booming.
In fact, this word model I react to very negatively. There is no such thing as a model. You have to be dynamic, you have to evolve, you have to meet changing circumstances. If you become prisoners of a model, you're going to remain frozen on time. You need the flexibility.
When I say model, what I mean is, where are the jobs and the sources of income and opportunities for people going to come out of? Is it going to come out of the state providing them with taxpayer-funded fiscal goodies, or is it going to come out of the economy generating sources of employment?
Economy has to generate, no doubt about it. The jobs have to come from economic growth. Economic growth will be driven by private investment, increasingly, with public investment playing a selective role, not certainly the role that it played in the 70s and 80s. So, I mean, growth will have to deliver jobs, but there is still room for a Mahatma Gandhi Narega type of intervention. There is still room for the state to intervene selectively in matters relating to social infrastructure like health, which we have
and market
seen,
failure,
or social security, or market failure. I agree, but markets can fail and governments also can fail. So I am not one of those. I'm not a government fundamentalist. I'm not a market fundamentalist either. I think where markets work, we should allow markets to work. If we regulate the markets, sometimes the regulation has to be tight regulation. Sometimes the regulation has to be light regulation. So it all depends. You can have market-friendly modes of regulation as well. But we can't wish away markets. We can't wish away the state either. So economic policy is an evolving mix of state intervention and market promoting interventions.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pooja.
Thank
you.